Welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this panel session from SciCode, a Code Confidence panel. So today's topic is why building a complete ASPM start with next-gen SAST. So this is a session that is part of our AppSec Secret Series, our monthly webinar. So probably quite a few of you already joined us previously. So we're happy to see you again and welcome for everyone else that is joining as a first. I'm your host today. I'm Guillaume Montard. I'm the head of product at SciCode. I was formerly the founder and the CEO of Bear, a modern AI-powered SaaS that was acquired by SciCode a few months ago. I'm excited today to be joined by a very special guest, James Bertotti. James is the founder of Latiotech. He brings more than a decade of experience, I guess, now in engineering and different security role. I've been spending years reviewing different technology, solving security and different business challenges from the real world. So I think we have an amazing host for the discussion. An amazing host, yes, myself for sure, and an amazing panelist and guest today with James. Latiotech that James did set up is here to help connect people with the right product based on that experience that he's bringing for both security and engineers in general. So we do have a lot of knowledge here today for that topic, and I'm going to kickstart it right away because I think we have a lot to unpack today, James. So we can dive. I guess we can start with probably a first kind of journey in that discussion is where is SAST today in general. I think something that probably a lot of us here knows is that SAST is not new. It's not like one of those new trendy category of product. It's been out there for probably 20 years now. So what is SAST and why is it probably still one of the starting point of securing applications today, James?
Yeah, I think the evolution of SAST is just an incredibly interesting topic and idea. I think the core of it is definitely when people think of application security, it's probably the first type of analysis or scanner that comes to mind because it's definitely the closest related to your code directly. But what makes it so interesting to me is I think that SAST sort of went mid market or like had this big demand explosion around SCA scanning at like the same time. And I think that makes it very interesting to think about like what is SAST today and what is its role because um, it came about to try to scale the work of like application security engineers, right? Where instead of trying to manually review thousands of lines of code with like a quarterly release cycle or whatever, you needed automated testing and ways to do that. And so the demands of a scanner early on were like thoroughness and a lot of historical languages like more classical C++, Java type stuff that enterprises are using like very enterprise focused. A scan could take days to a week because the idea is that it's like automating this big review process. And I think the rise of sort of this like DevSecOps, SCA, SAST thing really changed. Instead of how do we scan like a monolithic giant repo, how do we get the fastest possible scan that can run in pipeline? Because I think what's sort of missed in this is that like SCA scanning is very, very simple compared to SAST, but we expect them both to happen in like the same amount of time. And so it really comes down to like people want to scan every code change, but then it gets hard to get the context of the wider application. And so all of that to say that there's a real trade-off in SaaS today, I think, between um, getting a quick in pipeline, quick and dirty sort of scan of a microservice, and then people who want this like big enterprise feeling, in depth, like looking at a giant mono repo. And I think that's what creates this sort of weird tension in the market around like historic players who it's all about brand perception as well. I know I'm touching on a lot of different topics here, but I think really from what I've seen just from testing different SaaS tools, it's really more brand perception than anything, where it's like the historic players have sort of this brand perception of like, this is a very serious scan because it takes so long and it's doing such thorough, good analysis. And then there's like the faster scans that are seen as like maybe less secure, but they're running faster. And I think the truth is really somewhere in the middle, and it has a lot more technical detail than what the brand story would tell you.
Yeah, I think this is like it's interesting the way you put it. Like SCA kind of give a kick to SAST because SAST is not new, like we said, and probably the way to use SAST, of course, at the origin and 5, 10 years ago is very different than the way we probably anticipate using SAST today. And SCA is probably a good reason for that. But you still have like those two mindsets in the room, I guess. And so when we look at those solutions, I think there's a lot of debate usually when you talk about SAST. Everybody has different like perception. It's not like everyone agree. Should we do it? Shouldn't we do it? How should we do it? Is it good? Is it bad? It's a very heated arguments usually when you come into a room, and a lot of people have different uh, feedback. You think it's really necessarily based on that what you mentioned about that kind of enterprise way of seeing SaaS and that more like modern like kind of SCA way of seeing SaaS? Is it part of it? Is there like more to it?
I think the thing that I keep going to more and more, and you can tell me your opinion on this, is I think there's really two personas in security, and it's what makes it so hard. There's the person who takes it like very seriously from a compliance regulatory standard, who is like in depth, wants to be as sure as possible that there is zero vulnerability going into it. And I think that just lends itself to enterprise more because there's more process driven stuff. It's not that it's like inherent in enterprises, which is why I think that large tech companies especially tend to have a more like rapid thought process that's more in line with this other persona. That's more, my background was like I was a DevOps guy who got into security, and then like that security mindset sort of to me, I was just shocked by looking at all these scan results that I saw from all these tools, and like nothing happened. Like quarter after quarter, it was like pulling teeth to get a single thing done ever. And that was my experience, which fuels a lot of my perspective, which is like, look, it's going to be a lot of false positives. Let's just like get these scans done. Let's get the results to developers. Let's like try to actually have movement on these, is what I care about much more than this idea of like we have the perfect scan. And I think that that's really the persona struggle that's happening more than anything inherent to like the enterprise versus the mid market. It's just that DevOpsy type people tend to be more at mid market companies because they're the ones who are doing like more Kubernetes cloud native architectures. They need more of like a jack of all trades. Maybe they have less like enterprise AppSec experience where you would have someone from a more development background. And so I think that the personas kind of slide into those different companies a little more commonly.
Yeah, I can absolutely relate to that. I guess it's also linked to the kind of the maturity of the organization when it comes to DevSecOps, and we talk a lot about shift left as well, however it's perceived. But it's all about what do you do at the end of the day with those scams, and can you actually remediate those issues? And it goes back to the original reasons of why you're doing it. Is it more compliance? And probably the negative way of seeing it is the checkbox exercise that I think nobody really want to do. But this is probably something that tend to happen more traditionally in some organization, where if you have the DevSecOps mindset, it's like more about, well, give me less, but at least give me something that is good enough that I can act upon right now, and basically I can fix it. And of course, the tool probably should behave and work differently in that case. The results should happen in a different place. And ultimately, I guess this is the difficulty in the market today that we've seen, is that depending of where you stand on those two sides, the problem is like we end up with a lot of solutions that have been built under one paradigm and try to disguise themselves into another paradigm. And I think it leads back to like different challenges that probably you hear also quite a lot regarding SAST. You mentioned a few like false positive, but I think there are a few more, and you can touch on that point. But I guess it leads to that, and ultimately it's the right tool for the right job. But the question is, what is the right job? And then maybe we can talk about the right tool.
Yeah, I think the differentiation between like the compliance purposes versus um like the risk profile of a company doing SAST for pure security reasons does lead as well to the different prioritizations around it, where um if your AppSec program is primarily being driven by compliance concerns, not that you don't care about security as well, it's just that the reason that you're buying this set of tools is fundamentally that you have some requirement to have combinations of them, and you're just looking for a way to make progress in the most seamless way possible is sort of one approach, as opposed to the like, I run a healthcare company, and if anything gets breached here, like there are very serious legal consequences that come along with it. Is definitely another dimension in the like what creates the right criteria. But I think this is also just from my experience with SAST, like I was asked to evaluate SAST for the first time before I had done any development work, really. Like every DevOps person sort of is always doing light development work, but I wasn't doing any like serious like building end-to-end Java services or anything. And when I was evaluating SAST, I think like most security people, it was evaluating entirely on the discovery capabilities of it, and like trying to trick the scanner and like look at all these weird edge cases I'm coming up with, and why didn't it detect that? Oh, here's the limitations. And I've really over time seen that testing methodology as a fundamental flaw that we do as an industry, both when we're assessing tools that we want to buy, and it's a disservice to when we give vendors feedback, where like when you actually have a tool, you just want real findings to get to the right people so that they can get fixed. But when you're assessing a tool, you often don't even fix a single finding. Like you are purely evaluating the detection capabilities of the tool. And so vendors typically have to have this like on off switch that we're telling them to make, basically, where it's like, all right, during the demo, let's turn this thing all the way up so that it detects every possible false positive, true positive, whatever. And then in reality, we'll turn the knob the other way. And that's like reachability analysis to like, all right, here's what's actually a concern. And so I think we have to also change our evaluation criteria with this stuff to make it more about like fixing things and seeing progress, and less about like, check out how I tricked this scanner by like calling one service from another service and like, haha, it didn't catch it.
Yeah, like I guess you talk about false positive, true positive in that sense. Is like what do you want? Do you want to find like everything possible, or do you want to be able to resolve some of those? I guess that's kind of the trade-off and the balance that everybody is looking for. And to your point, the evaluation phase is usually a bit biased in that sense. And I think in the SaaS world, unfortunately there is only a few benchmarking projects, for instance, about like the quality of the scanners, and it's quite well known that some vendors definitely super optimize their scanners
Oh yeah.
on those projects. So in real life, what is it really? So it's more like the operational aspect that you should be looking for, more than actually just the quality, or trying to trick the scanners, as you mentioned. It's interesting viewpoint on that. And like today, like, do you think there is any big misconception itself when it comes to SAST that you see like regularly when talking with customers?
Yeah, I think there's what we talked about earlier, which is the like perception that an older enterprise player also has better scanning just because they're like an older enterprise player, without any sort of like actual evaluation, where it's like, hey, like our ability to pick apart code has gotten a lot better. And honestly, a lot of those older scanning methodologies have difficulties interpreting like newer frameworks. Like you have to, I'm sure from the time with Bearer, like the building scanning engines around frameworks makes it a lot more doable thing. And that's why even when you see something like, hey, we support JavaScript now, it's like, all right, well, you've just opened like Pandora's box of like, which JavaScripts do you support? And even within Django, like there's so many weird language specific things. I just love this Django example because there's an image tag that is vulnerable to cross-site scripting, like only within Django, because it sanitizes cross-site scripting everywhere else, but not in the image tag. And that's the kind of finding that like Bob's SAST tool or like enterprise, like most SAST tools aren't going to find that. And that's where it gets into the difficult nuances of like, there are real trade offs in like detection versus like the framework specific guidance that you're getting, which leans into some of this like open source trade offs as well. So, big picture, misconception wise, it's the idea that like there's not trade offs happening, or that you're just like buying this perfect sort of solution. And then I'll say with that, I still get frustrated at how many people I talk to uh, are looking for these like individual tool replacements and don't realize how the results can inform one another. And Polyfill is a great example of people who were just SCA scanners were having to like manually build searches to look for open source packages that were using the Polyfill domain name, but like SAST providers were actually the ones who could just run a simple code search for the text and like get to the supply chain security issue faster than an SCA scanner. And DAST actually was a great solution there as well, because then you can just check the front end to see if it's calling the CDN directly. And so that's just where it's like all of these different scanners, uh, no matter the kind of issue, when a vulnerability comes up, like you kind of need all the capabilities to be able to like respond to something. It's not enough to just say like, oh, well, I have SAST because it's the most important, and so that's what I'm investing in.
I fully agree with you, and that's like the 1 + 1 = 3, I guess, and the ultimate value proposition of going beyond point solution and beyond silo. You can also think about it because I have an interesting example from a customer I was talking about very shortly. They have like thousands and thousands of applications. They're looking for a very, very specific type of vulnerability and asking like, should we do SAST or should we do DAST? Well, realistically, you're probably going to have trouble like plugging your dust on thousands and thousands of repo, but you might have probably no false positive in that aspect. So maybe it's like a combination. It's like a
But it's
funnel.
just
Use
different false positives is the problem.
and it's going to be different, absolutely. But combining and getting the best out of those two to be able to, well, do that mix of going deeper and broader, kind of the two things, uh, has a lot of sense. It's the same example as you did with the polyfile, actually. So that's really that thing about going beyond the silo, going beyond the point solution. I think this is one of the change in the market that we're kind of seeing today. And of course, this is something that we can talk a lot about.
And that's
And yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
it's just I could get like every modern example comes up with this issue. Like XZutils, like you need a container scanner for that because it's open SSH package. But if you wanted to detect if you were importing it somewhere, then you would need something analyzing the code to see if you're calling SSH stuff anywhere. And the way to detect it upstream would have been like an SCA vendor doing upstream malware detection. And so there's like you need really all of this to try to detect a real world attack. It's not enough to just say, uh, you know, we have some ultimate solution with only one scanner.
So is it like also like does that goes into the lens of I think something that you mentioned often is like in-house point solution are not necessarily best in class or actually not anymore. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, I mean it's a huge. I continue to be running more and more evaluations now that I just went full time with Latio 2 months ago. Before that, I was at PagerDuty, and now that I have some more time, like being able to run more and more like strict evaluations between tools, like there's a lot that gets caught up in like brand perception that's really has very little to do with the reality of like when you run a test. Like most of my testing has very similar results between tools. And honest, like a lot of times there are weird caveats, whether something's like sort of a point solution or part of a platform, like maybe it was an acquisition that never really fully got integrated, or maybe it did fully get integrated, or maybe they scrapped it and built a new scanning engine from scratch. Like there are a lot of things that get caught up in the details that lead to like real usability issues for users. But overall, what I'd say is like that's why I focus on usability even more than the specific findings, as long as the specific findings aren't missing anything like egregiously wrong. Um, they're like little bells and whistles that are like, oh, cool, this detected like somewhere where I'm uploading a file and said, hey, make sure you uh, check that file for sanitization. Like that's a neat little uh, detection thing, but I'm not basing my whole product buying decision on like, oh, it caught a file upload issue where I'm not doing any file validation or something.
So do you think like for the audience and people that are listening and that have been buying and experiencing SaaS for many years, is there anything like today that you should probably unlearn when you're making the decision to purchase a new solution, a new maybe more modern SaaS in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I for people who have been in AppSec longer than me, because I'm pretty new to AppSec, like I always want to be careful with like, um, there are a lot of hard lessons learned from older school application security as far as like really getting good. in-depth results and creating processes to manage it. But from my experience, like the way that DevOps has changed both the scale of code deployments and the speed at which it happens, it simply is more important to just keep up and give developers the right information at the right time. That's the only way to be proactive at this point. Like if your program is based on like we run a cron job type scan and then get those results to developers like after the fact, that is just super time consuming and difficult. And I've been blessed to only work with like DevOps native solutions, so I always forget that like there's this whole other category of tooling that exists that's like the nightmare zone as I think of it, of like just manually uploading code, pointing it at like SSH repos because there's no like GitHub OAuth to like get the app easily installed, manually running lambdas to import all of your repos manually, like or via the API if they have one. Like you're creating all of this manual process around your tool. And that's the thing that I run into a lot when I'm talking with people around like people in security are very burned out on like tool switching, like, oh, there's a new acronym every month. How am I supposed to keep on top of all of this? Whatever. And the real answer is just like every once in a while evaluate a new tool or at least just do a demo of it because you probably don't realize how much time you're wasting on like all of these processes. And so something that I ran into a lot in my own evaluations and switching tools is we have this perception of like we've built all this process around like CNAP's an easy example because like there are some bad CNAPs out there where like I've inherited a bad CNAP. We've created a bunch of processes around managing that bad CNAP, whether it's like scripts, shipping vulnerabilities all over the place, Excel files flying all over the place, like compliance, manual review meetings. And then the thought we have is like, oh, if we switch CNAPs, think of all the work it's going to be to port those processes over. And the actual answer is like, hey, if you're using a good CNAP, like those, you don't need those bad processes anymore.
Free of charge.
Yeah, and that's what I get at with like this SaaS stuff is you probably don't even realize the amount of like manual weird work you're doing that modern products just sort of take away from you. Like look, you just click the authorize button in GitHub. All your repos are in there. They're all getting scanned. They're all getting webhook scanned. There's no more like pipeline jobs, maintaining images. Like all of this work you've done to maintain infrastructure is automatically taken care of for you by the new solution. And you're worried about switching solutions because you're worried about like, what about getting all that other stuff over? But that stuff just goes away.
Yeah, like I think the biggest example I have of that is like a lot of the time customers are asking me like, but how often do you scan? I don't understand that question. Like it's not a question about how often I scan. I scan everything all the time. No, but let me ask you again. Like how often do you scan? Well, the paradigm and the solution, the mindset completely change. And sometimes it's difficult to actually be on the same page and talk the same language because, of course, when you've been using something in a certain way for a long time, it's difficult to imagine you can do it differently and it can actually solve all those problems probably for you. And there are other things to look for, obviously. But yeah, like that's probably like the for solutions that have been out there for many years and where realistically you don't have like breakthrough innovation that completely transformed the market. It's like natural evolution, but it's still a lot of evolution over the years. It's still difficult to realize that yeah, things can still be called SAST, but can actually work and realize a very different outcome than something else that is also called SAST and you've been using for many years. And I think it's just difficult for us as any individual when we're in front of those small iterative changes over the years to imagine like how different it can be.
Yeah, and that's the thing I always also want to be sensitive to is like how do you accomplish this at big enterprise scale? Because like I that's a blind spot in my personal work history is like PagerDuty is the biggest company I've been a part of, and it's not like it's big, but it's not like massive bank scale of company. And I think the fear is a lot of people when they think of like program switching, they get in their head like how am I going to create this perfect new like here's our new SaaS tool and like we've got new documentation and we've got new processes and I've coordinated with every PM over every product team and like created a 6 month rollout strategy and all of that. But to me, that's like applying that waterfall ideology, but to like business processes. And instead, the answer should be like, hey, what if you get a more modern tool like Cycode? You like put it into one piece of the organization. Like most orgs have like some sort of like innovation group or dev group. And the alternative is like right now you're probably just blind to whatever they're doing because you haven't gotten the process in place yet with the innovation center or however you're thinking about it. And the real answer is like you should just use that as your testing ground for some of these modern security tools as well, so that you do this like scaled deployment. You figure out what kind of works there as you're working with those developers on it, and then you slowly do this rollout. And that's why I think when I define ASPM more broadly, it includes both doing your own scanning to meet that sort of like innovation use case, but then also the ability to import those other findings, because you're not telling the company like, look, I know you've spent 10 years rolling out every kind of SaaS scanner under the sun for different reasons, whatever. Like we will also ingest those results and be able to give feedback to developers for that stuff too over time.
Interesting. I'd like to talk about a topic that we hear more and more, and I think a lot from the mid markets, but the mid market usually also infers some interesting changes in the DevSecOps world, I would say, is the open source scanners. I think the mid market is a very prominent users of open source scanners. Like, what's your take on those? Do you see like any limitations? What did you potentially use also at PagerDuty? Maybe like you were qualifying years ago as a
Yep.
mid market company, I would say. So you might have
Yep.
experienced that as well.
One, PagerDuty is a big Elixir shop amongst other things, and so that's an like there's not a lot of enterprise Elixir scanning options out there. So we definitely had a combination of in-house, off the shelf, like everything sort of that you could have. And to me, security people are needlessly side taking or like divided on open source, where like some people will say, oh, that's just some open source thing, and they won't even look at it if it like, or that my least favorite thing is to just call it a wrapper. So it's like, oh, this is just a wrapper for Zap or a wrapper for SemGrep or whatever, right? Like it's this idea that like if something's just a wrapper, then it's bad. And it's like you need like just focus on the outcome. Like I don't care what the scanning engine is. Like all that matters is like are the results good and can I get them to developers to get remediated in time? I don't care if the scanning engine itself is open source or not. We're not like it's a much more debatable thing around open sourcing your detection rules for like a SOC environment where you're trying to like catch attacks, but open sourcing your like rules for proactive discovery of misconfigurations is like it's only really a good thing unless you think your devs are like insider threats who are like trying to curt the open source rules that are out there. Like there's not really a downside to it being open source. But on the upside, on the other side, like there the benefit to it not being open source, a lot of security people I think in terms of like the benefit is the rules aren't out there for people to discover. But I think the actual benefit is that uh, there's a real developer commitment internal to the company of building a meaningful SAST engine that's not outsourced or limited based on another proprietary engine. And so to me, it has more to do with like a long-term business risk decision than it has to do with like any uh, direct consequence. And all that to say that I don't, when I'm evaluating tools, like it has zero impact, like if the scanner or the scanning engine is open source or not. The thing I'll add though to that Django example is sometimes if you're using specific frameworks, it is beneficial to use like the open source scanner specific to that framework because it typically has better results than something that's trying to be an all-in-one generic sort of scanner.
Yeah, it's difficult to be a great scanner through COBOL to Rust, which is
Right.
sometimes what we're asked. Without kidding, this is sometimes what we're asked to be.
Yep.
That's to your point. But ultimately, I think what you're saying goes back to what you were saying at the beginning. It's all about the ultimate outcome, the operational aspect of it. It's not about the trying to trick or the quality of the finding. Is as long as you reach kind of a threshold that is satisfactory and you don't miss any of the big things, is like how can you really exploit it at the end. So whatever open source, not open source, is not really the topic. I'm quite aligned with you here. And now asking you to wear your like developer hat. You've been experiencing like SAST as a developer and still talking to a lot of developers and probably see a lot of things through that lens. What are the like specific pains that we're talking about when we think about SAST for them?
Yeah, I think the number one pain is that they're not built for like modern architectures, where when SAST looks at the context, typically they only have access to the repo context and they lack the like overall application structure. And so that creates a lot of false positives around like especially like cross-site scripting, where it's like someone could inject JavaScript here, but then they don't know that upstream you've got something else that's filtering the data before it gets down to that service. And that's the hard work that a developer who gets that ticket, that's like, hey, this function's vulnerable to cross-site scripting. Like the hardest part of this whole thing that gets under. I remember I did a webinar like 4 or 5 years ago, where the question got asked, is it harder to find things or fix things? And to me, it's like it is so much obviously harder to fix things, but the survey response was like 50-50, like harder to find versus fix. And that speaks to like the security emphasis on finding. But like the developer had, like, it is way the hardest part is getting that ticket and then trying to validate, is this real or not? And that's the first thing that a developer is going to do. And I actually don't think it should be the first. I think that's the developer training that needs to happen, is like, look, instead of spending all of this time like trying to, because what you would do is like spin up a local version of your app, connect into like a staging Kubernetes cluster, start running like your own custom burp against the service to see if it's really vulnerable, see if you can pull off a cross-site scripting. Like, that is in-depth, very difficult security research where you or I are probably doing something wrong along the way. And at the end of it, we probably don't even really know if we're vulnerable or not. We just sort of like weren't comically vulnerable, as we like try to do these very basic pen tester things. Um, and I think instead the tool needs to help people learn like, uh, just add this sanitizer. Like, it is so low risk to just like add a dot sanitize to that function. Like, just add it and move on. And so to me, that's the biggest developer pain point, is this self-inflicted slash lack of training slash lack of like security uh
And honestly,
guidance on like what should I do, because a lot of security people will dive, like I'm tempted to do this, where like a developer will say, hey, I got this cross-site scripting finding, like, can you help me figure out if it's real or not? And all of a sudden we're both hopping in and doing burp suite stuff. Like, we love to try to validate findings when the actual patch would take a few seconds if we just added the sanitizer, if we just had and I think that's the heart of this secure by design stuff, is not like, how do we policy as code everything. I'm sort of mixed on that. It's more like, hey guys, here's our solution, the cross-site scripting. Like, just import this library and add this function to it. And that's sort of the guidance that developers need to make it like a simple thing.
so ultimately, you think they lack sometimes education, they lack probably guidance, and is there any way around that? What have you seen like that is successful here that really help them
I think it's the
go,
guidance.
go the guidance? Okay,
Yeah, it's
and
very
like AI is a topic for you in that sense.
sort of, AI can be its own foot gun here, because like one of the implementations I'm most proud of was like, we had a custom decorator, not at PagerDuty, at another company I was at. We had a custom decorator in Spring to mark when something was a public facing GraphQL endpoint. And as part of that decorator, we added automatic sanitization to it. And so that way, whenever we ran a SAST scan, we put a custom rule in to exempt that decorator from those findings. And like, that's what I mean by guidance, is not just like, because so much of this, the content that's out there is like secure code warrior training stuff, and this isn't, I haven't used any of their stuff, so this isn't like a dig at them or anything. It's just the kind of content we have is like, here's what cross-site scripting is, here's common ways to prevent it. And like that is only half of the solution. Like a developer needs like, okay, for our application, like what is our way to defend this attack? And that's the foot gun with AI is you depend because I know several companies like doing just this, and even they've all taken sort of different approaches to how they build those AI responses. Like some of them are doing pure LLM stuff on top of other findings. Some of them are doing their own novel detections with contextual remediation. Some of them are saying like import our security libraries and just use those. And they all have different pros and cons to them, but it speaks to the true challenge here is like the guidance on what do you develop or do for your organization to fix these specific findings that come up.
Yeah, right. Yeah, some are probably generic, the way to fix, and sometimes it's very custom business logic, like the decorator that you were mentioning. And this is where usually in the SaaS world you end up into building custom rules,
Yeah.
creating that rule set, but that's tedious. It's not
And
simple.
that's so there's two things I want to talk about there. The one is like the 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 fixes example. I think SQL injection is a good example of this, where it's like if you OWASP lookup cheat sheet how to fix a SQL injection, it's parameterized queries. But if you're using an ORM, that also automatically takes care of those SQL injections for you. And so it's like the that's what the guidance is to a developer is like here's which one to use. And then on the I forget what the other uh, piece was. Oh, the custom rules thing. This is so tough to get over because it's like on the one hand, the idea of custom rules once you've gotten for I think people who aren't super in this world like don't care about custom rules at all. But then once you've started to dig in and you're like flirting with creating your own sanitizer, like I've done before and stuff, it's like then all of a sudden those custom rules are looking real juicy to like build your own custom scanners for everything. But then you're just doing the DIY approach again. It's like why are you even paying a vendor if you're just going to like make your own giant list of custom rules that's going to become tech debt, that's going to become irrelevant, that like once you're on to your fifth new job somewhere, like someone's going to be trying to maintain this giant list of custom rules. And so it is like this we need to create just very clear, simple, standardized ways to remediate findings.
Interesting. So touching on the maybe ROI stuff, like if you have like any advice, any recommendation for people that would like to actually go on the SaaS journey or maybe restart their SaaS journey because they tried and it didn't work out, what kind of recommendation can you give?
Yeah, I think it like a lot of it comes down to like believe that better tools are out there. Like my first SCA and SaaS journeys were monumental disasters. Like I wasted a ton of time implementing a SAST with a company like because I evaluated it purely on like how good is the sensor, and I had all the developers like what's hard about most security people will have developers as part of the vetting process, but we can really lead them astray like I did because I was asking them like are the detections correct or interesting and are they not false positives. So I was having the devs focus only on that and 0% on usability. And so that created the nightmare process where like we were having like a quarterly review meeting with developer leadership, like going over our SAST results and like figuring out what was a true positive or a false positive and prioritizing. Like it was such a waste of time for us and for like very high level developer leadership that like needs to be working on product. And I'm sitting there wasting their time with this tool that's like false positives and difficult to figure out like is this real or not, or difficult to figure out like what is the finding really trying to tell me and all of that. And it was only by shifting to a new tool that ran more in pipeline and got the findings to developers quickly, and it was more in the repository context where they're working, that I was able to have more instead of having to have a quarterly meeting with like chief architect. I was able to have like quick Slack message exchange with like junior developer who's getting this SAST finding. And that really sped up. It got rid of the bottleneck of like chief security architect and chief developer architect like having to have big meeting to like run through this list, to really like democratize that approach. And so that's why to me it's about being willing to just experiment with different tools that are creating different workflows along the way. And I think keeping those like small POC deployments is like a big part of that, where you're not trying to like create a 3-year commitment of like this is our SAST tool for like ever across the entire organization, but you're willing to sort of be flexible and try different things out along the way.
Okay, so even in terms of deployment, going through step by step, depending of the different maturity of each team, seeing how it goes. Like I think we sometimes hear customers saying, "Yeah, I want to block everything." Well, maybe don't go there right away. That's probably not going to end up very well. Let's do it step by step. Let's see how your developers are responding to it. Maybe there is a way also to kind of curate the rule set because maybe some are not very much working for you. So yeah, it's like it's not 0 or 1. I think what I'm getting from your advice is
Yeah.
like first think that okay, it's still called SAST, but maybe your experience from the past is not the experience you're going to get today. And second, it's not 0 or 1, not all in. Take the time. It's not that simple. But I would imagine that you would still recommend that should be one of the pillar of their security program even today in 2024.
Oh yeah. I mean, when it comes, I generally, I mean, I have to separate like future thinking James from like present company James, because future me thinks that like the ideal security program here is like one all of my scanning in a single place. Because if for most companies, especially not at the giant massive enterprise scale, like your production assets are defined as code, and your production code obviously is code. And so you should scan all of that at one place and get results to developers. And then like CSPM, like cloud scanning, is like an afterthought because it's in the context of drift from the IAC. And then you've got like a totally separate runtime solution that's only focused on like, is an attacker exploiting my environment? And so this is like a CSPM CNAP-less future state that I would love to see happen. But like for present, as far as like prioritizing an application security program, like it what's the starting point for code security? Because the way a lot of like early companies getting involved in this stuff will think about it is like, all right, I've got a cloud security solution, and then I need a code security solution. And SAST is definitely, if you want to do code security at all, step one is like simple branch protection rules and like GitHub configuration stuff. But then step two is you'll get a lot more value out of SAST than SCA. And SCA is definitely like hotter in a broad sense because it's tied into this like supply chain idea and it feels kind of like cool and fresh. But first of all, you're getting those results from your container scanning solution, and not a lot of people like put that together. But container scanning continues to build SCA detections into it more and more. So there's some caveats there, but from a pure result visibility perspective, there are benefits that are more workflow related to like separating the two. But from a pure visibility, what's missing from my program perspective, you have a lot of that with your container scanning thing. And so SAST is like the big blind spot on the AppSec side of things. Everything else is sort of other places you can find it. But then as you add in to that AppSec scanning solution, it just gets the real thing you're trying to solve is getting developers involved in security. And that's why I shift a lot of that to ASPM, because once the developers get involved with SAST, like, oh, hey, these are the same guys that should also be fixing the container vulns and should also be fixing the IAC misconfigurations and should also be fixing the SCA package JSON type stuff. And like, you want to get all those findings to developers with the same things we've talked about today, where it's like speed and getting it to them early and having it be easy to integrate and maintain, like having it be sensible in the code context. That's why all these things are related. But SAST is definitely like the starting point scanner for application security.
It's interesting because I think like you often hear like customers trying to start with SCA because SCA is for different reasons easier, I would say. But ultimately, what you're saying is you will get much more value if you actually start the SaaS, even though the effort might be a bit higher. The impact will drastically be more important, especially because you are already somehow covered on the SES side with the container scanning.
And it's
That's,
the thing that I'll add there is just like, look, I'm going from my personal experience, and I have never seen a true positive with an SCA scan. Like, because there are so many contextual issues in convert. How does a CVE on a transitive dependency convert to actual business risk is one of the hardest problems that's out there to solve. And that's why, like, a SAS scanner, like a SQL injection is a SQL injection. Like, uh,
yeah, yeah, right.
and it,
It's closer to the risk. It's easier to assess the risk itself. You talk about ASPM, so which give me an amazing segue to like talk about that. And especially there is a term that we love at Psychod is talking about complete ASPM. What's your definition of a complete ASPM?
yeah, I mean that this is an article that I continue to have endless debates about and stuff with ASPM, because ASPM was born out of ASOC, which is like an orchestration idea of like it comes out of enterprise. You had teams that self bought their own scanners. You've got all these scanners out there. Let's plug them all into a single dashboard to then orchestrate our visibility across all of our AppSec program. Um, but then when I saw everyone sort of rebranded to ASPM around that idea, because the reality of where these companies were at when that took hold was like some people had different scanners at different maturities, and they also integrated for some different stuff, and so everyone sort of qualified into that category in some way. And to me, ASPM is just like, it's much easier to take that category and parallel it to CSPM, where like when there's early CSPM, which was a lot the same way, where there's a lot of different takes and like, what is it, whatever. But now, like a CSPM, I expect it to have workload scanning and uh, general cloud configuration scanning in the same place at a minimum. Like that's what I'm expecting a CSPM to have. That's like a complete CSPM. And so for ASPM, I just made that same idea, but for the application side. And that's the idea of the complete ASPM, is it's like it is everything you need to do application security, which is all of these different scanners, uh, and being able to integrate with other scanners and create workflows and searching. And so that's the heart of the idea, is it's like it's the one solution for end-to-end application security scanning. Uh, I This is a weird caveat to make, but I just feel like I have to make it. I don't think CSPM should have ever added like the workload thing and became CNAP and this big weird monstrosity of a product. And so that's why for ASPM, I'm okay leaving the runtime stuff to like runtime application security is still, that's why I prefer ADR for that. And it's still a very evolving new like thing that people are still figuring out what the heck that is, because application security people don't have a historic ability to do security operations work. Like there's just no framework for like, what do you do when you put a Java developer in a SOC? Like that's just not something people have done. And so that is still getting figured out. But the ASPM to me is very much like end to end posture management that gives you everything you need in one place to do application security.
And SAST and AST in general is like one layer of the scanners, or is it also more than that in that ASPM model?
Yeah, it's one of the many scanners. As far as I look at it as all of the files that are in a repo should be able to get scanned with one thing. Because the alternative to that is you're freaking running like 5 pipelines of like, here's our IAC scanner, our container scanner, our SAS scanner, our SCA scanner, our SDLC scanner, our SBOM generator, our image signer. Like you are doing secrets, DAST, uh, drift detection. Like are you running like 10 security jobs simultaneously inside your pipeline? Like that's the alternative. um and that's why that just doesn't make sense to me, and I look for like the one thing. You shouldn't need 10 different solutions just to cover all of the files that are very, like every repo at most organizations has a little bit of Terraform, a little bit of pipeline definition, a little bit of Helm chart, a little bit of first party code, and some declarations of third party code and a Docker file. And so like that is one scanner. It's not
Yeah.
10 different things that
But
you need to.
going to the SPM value proposition, because one, like you mentioned, definitely is about consolidating and not having to set up and operationalize like 10 different scanners. But also it goes beyond that. It's also about prioritization, because it's not about like getting 10 times more vulnerabilities, findings. It's also how can the ASPM really build a tool to tell you those are the 10% that you should focus on. And then when you think about that, how do you think about prioritization in the SaaS context? Like, is it you still do prioritization the way SaaS endpoint solution have been doing prioritization forever, based on the severity of rules, basically, simple as that? Or do you see like another benefit of SaaS inside the SPM world when it comes to that prioritization aspect?
Yeah, this is where, because on the ASPM spectrum of vendors, there are people who are more on the testing side, and there are people who are more on the vulnerability management side. And what's really tough for me to think about is like the amount of context that each of those providers has. And generally, the more context, the better for prioritization and workflows things can get. And that's what's sort of a hard decision is like how much context is actually necessary or not. So, from an ASPM perspective of like total code coverage, like there are definitely benefits to knowing like what pipelines run in this. Is this a public facing web app? Where in the stack does it sit? Like those sorts of things. But as you try to prioritize, you're going to get closer and closer to runtime context and runtime reachability. And that's where there's a huge question mark still around like, does that mean every ASPM provider should have their own agent that can then send runtime details back to the hub? Or do they integrate to get that data? And does that data even matter? Because you can run a lot of static reachability pretty well, and try to do false positive elimination based on like, is this SCA package function called in my code base? Like, is that SAST or SCA? Like the line sort of blurs there.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, you
yeah,
need the SaaS technology to do it. I think this is what we're seeing in the market today. And it's interesting the way you see it, because you can attack that problem from two angles. Absolutely, like getting the data and the context from production, which a lot of us are doing, trying to do, and also you can see the more like the production kind of provider trying to go into the AppSec
exactly.
territory for that matter. But we've seen that for many, many years, and kind of that shift, like left going right and right going left, so far never really happened for different reasons. It's not just the technology; it's like a lot of other things. And you can also attack it from the other side. Is like actually yes, code analysis is difficult, but you can actually do many more magic than what we used to do with reachability analysis, even in the context of SAST, in the context of SC in that case, and so on. So maybe the answer is both, and the market is still yet decided about where exactly uh, we get the benefit from.
That's why I don't hate the idea of another vulnerability management tool that sits outside of this that sort of does some of that, because it's a tough, there are benefits to both that are real. Like getting static reachability before something's deployed, like that lets you get relevant results to developers before an application's deployed. And a lot of times developers don't care too much about like, not that they don't care, they just don't, it's not their job to know like what pod does this run in and how does it get to the Kubernetes cluster and blah blah blah. Like that stuff, that's data they don't always care about. But then on the runtime side, like that is the source of truth. Like if you want to really know if a function's executing or not, you can only check that at runtime. Everything else is sort of theoretical, even in the best case. And so that's why there's real trade-offs here, and I don't have a clear like here's the answer. Besides that, both can never
No,
hurt.
no, fair enough. And I think like we're all working toward like adding more of those context and that production aspect, and also like deeper analysis. Ultimately, to always go back to that topic of prioritization and better remediation, because things could be like a true positive, but ultimately they never get called for whatever reasons. So why focus your effort on remedying those when maybe some that you would imagine are like lower severity actually are potentially exploited? So
Yep.
you should focus your effort on that, and that's really an interesting angle on the ASPM side. I think for our audience that still is thinking about ASPM in general, like, can you share a little bit about kind of the impact on productivity, overhead, or cost controls that you've seen with your customers that adopted ASPM, and what would be your advice here when thinking about ASPM in general?
Yeah, I just think it makes everybody's life easier. Like, because no developer is going to log into like five different tools to check what the heck's going on with everything. Uh, you can't have a bunch of different like pull requests. Responses are cool and all, but you're not going to have like five different PR comments on every single push that are like every scanner checking every individual thing. Um, and then security doesn't have to maintain the image and deal with all of that stuff anymore. And so like the productivity impacts are just massive across the board of like you're getting visibility from one integration to everything. Uh, developers only have to check one tool and learn one, like, as every vendor is going to tell you like we built it so developers never have to log in, look at us, like it's all just they get a PR comment for everything. But like at the end of the day, the developer is going to have to learn the tool. Uh, Either they're going to learn it via like weird PR comments that don't make sense, or they're going to be logging into doing it, or like some combination of it. And so that's why they need to just go like, oh, Cycode is our security tool. It's too much to be like, oh, well, we use Cycode for this thing and we use this other tool for this thing. And like, here's all of the intricacies of what's getting scanned by what. It's just creating a lot of like mental overload for them. And so, all that to say, developers' lives are easier, security lives are easier. It doesn't solve every problem under the sun because like there are still things getting discovered that you have to fix, and nobody likes fixing that, and they need incentives and all that crap. But it is certainly the easiest option to try to get application security done.
Well, thanks, James. I think it's an amazing closing argument. We're at time, I think. So we're going to wrap up now. I really wanted to thank you because I think we went quite deep in the topic with like quite the detailed discussions and trying to cover like different angles from like security, from the legacy market, from developers, from an ROI perspective, from ASPM and SAST in general as well. So this has been a very interesting discussion, and I hope the audience appreciate it as well. Um, you also have a guest blog post series on our blog, so I invite everybody to check it out and read James' thoughts on the market, and also check out Lasio.tech. Do I pronounce Lasio or Lasio.tech actually?
Yep, it's whatever.
Okay,
That's fine.
well, now everybody knows how to spell it at least.
Yep.
So thank you, James. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you for our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.